it's Jim. So what does the creation account given to us in Genesis reveal to us about the intended construct of a day that Yahweh reveals to us in his scriptures? I've created the illustration you see before you in continuing effort and hope to communicate what now seems so extremely obvious to me. But before I go into what is obvious in the revelation that we find in the creation account, let me first start with what we've been told that it is conveying to us. Church teaching embraces that the start of the scriptural creation day begins with evening, and then it runs through morning. And they embrace that, but it doesn't have significant relevance to their lives, at least not in our world, in my area of the world today, because we work on the Gregorian calendar with the day starting in the middle of the night at 12:01 a.m., and that's how we're reckoning and going through our day. And if you're part of the church, you've already undone the seventh-day Sabbath and are now observing this Lord's Day that the church has moved from the seventh day according to the command to the first day according to church traditions and teaching. And they're keeping that basically for the day. So you wake up on a Sunday, which is the first day, and you just go to church. It really has no relevance because you're not really trying to start and stop a Sabbath, at least not in our world today. But if you're amongst those that have begun to embrace Torah, and that there is a growing community of those who have come to understand that the church really is Israel. It is the original. It is Israel, the blood relation of Israel, but it's also the Gentiles who are now joining Israel. Together we are the church, and it's coming into reality for many people. But when you start making that correlation, you begin to realize that Torah was never undone. It was, as the church teaches it was, but you will find that the Torah was never undone. And so Torah has relevance to us today. And so that means those of us who belong to the church, the assembled, the called out ones, who belong to the church and now are seeking to try to follow the commands of Torah because we think that's what he's called us to and never uncalled us to. And so we're trying to go back to that. Well, suddenly we're interested in figuring out how to keep the seventh-day Sabbath. And when that becomes important to us, what are we being told? What are we being told by church teachings? From the church would come this idea that a day starts in the evening, but it also comes from Judaism. When those of the Torah community begin trying to figure out how to keep law, who are we turning to figure this out? We're turning to Judaism. Now, I question the soundness and the wisdom of turning to Judaism for guidance in keeping Torah, because they were already being chastised for failing to keep it correctly from Yahushua himself, from the Messiah himself, from John the Baptist. They were already in error. And when you study out in the gospel accounts, when you study out how Messiah kept his Passover a full day before the Yehudim or the Jews did the next day, you know that it had gone so far to be even on separate days, different calendars. Not only were they observing from an evening to evening day, but they weren't even celebrating on the right day. I'm confident Yahushua, as demonstrated in the gospel accounts, was serving the sunrise start of the day, which would make the entire account of that last day of his life make sense. And when you follow it and you understand that and you see that, you can't really unsee it. But let's return to why is the church? Why does Judaism give us, and what are the reasons and the passages that they'll turn to as evidence that they are correctly observing an evening start to the day? Well, the creation account is one of the first places they go, alongside of the Passover accounts and the Day of Atonement accounts, subject for another day. But here's what they incorporate in that discussion, that the King James says, and the evening and the morning were the first day. When you go to Bible Hub and the other Christian teaching tools, They will teach you over and over again. I've seen it. Go find it for yourself. They will teach you that by having first declared evening as first, then it has established that a day begins with evening. And that's just errant teaching, because this passage, this scripture, does no such thing. It's received that way, and if you will not think it through, and if you will not test it, and you just receive it that way, you'll walk away from it not realizing that it's not even possible. Let's look at some of the other significant translations and how they're handling the words that become "and the evening and the morning were the first day." Well, the majority text translations, which is really just, taking a number of scribed versions and coming up with their majority outcome and how they, the majority of them translated. Well, there's an offering called a majority text translation Bible, and it reads like this: "There was evening and there was morning the first day." And I will say that this is a pretty common, when we go through the various popular translations that we can find out there, that's a pretty common rendering, more common than the King James Version rendering. When we turn to the actual standard Bible, the literal Bibles that are trying to be literal with the underlying Hebrew and Greek text, we turn to the literal standard, and it reads something like this. First of all, there's a ... because there's an idea being conveyed, and then they place a semicolon, and then they say, to finish a sentence, and rather than starting a new sentence, they read, "And there is an evening, and there is a morning, day one." Similar, but maybe nuanced. The Berean literal is very similar, and they start a new sentence. They say, "And there was evening, and there was morning, day one." Young's literal has a sentence ending in night. I should have had a ... here. A sentence ending in night, semicolon, "and there is an evening, and there is a morning, day one," just like the literal standard version. And then you have Smith's literal, and they have it as another thought too, the end of a thought. They've got a sentence ending here, and then they place a colon, not a semicolon, but a colon. And then they go on to translate as, "And the evening shall be, and the morning shall be." That again is a nuance change of what is being translated. I mean, it's got nuance change of meaning. And then I pulled in the Holman because it's one of the popular translations that is actually going against the tide, and they translated these words, the words in question, as "evening came and then morning the first day." Again, nuanced and slightly different. Let's look at the transliterated Hebrew word that is going into these various translations that are coming up with "and the evening and the morning." And there is an evening, because the word being translated is this idea of there is, or there was, and there is and it shall be. There came to be, there shall be. So what is the underlying word? It's wehi. And wehi is a version. The root word for wehi is Strong's 1961, called heya. And of all of the passages associated with this Strong's 1961 word heya, of them there are 3,561 occurrences related to it. So 3,561 occurrences related to heya. Of the words related to heya, 781 are wehi, and this word being wehi. And in the creation account, this is the word that's being used over and over again. When we go to Strong's defining heya, we have these three offerings. We have number one, and it's to exist. Number two is to be or become. And number three is to come into being, i.e. to happen or to occur. Those are the three options. If you go into Bible Hub and you look up wehi and the way it's being translated over and over and over again, even outside of the creation account, over and over again, the constant translation really has more of the concept of something becoming something. It was something and it became something else, or it came into being and then there was, or it came to happen or to occur. It is by far and away the most common use or rendering and translation of this word wehi. So it seems not only reasonable and plausible that the idea that should be being conveyed in the creation account is this idea that an evening came to be, or and then there was evening inside of an order. It not only seems reasonable and plausible, but it also now seems probable. Let me explain how I've attempted to illustrate this creation account for us that we find throughout Genesis chapter 1. First of all, I have tried to depict up here, starting up here, the day. And we're talking in this sense, not day as associated with daylight, but day as associated with day echad, the completeness of a day, the fullness of a day, which has two parts, the light and the dark, which we'll explain in a moment. So a day in this concept runs through the completion of a day. And I'll just quickly tell you, even though we need to get into the creation account itself and the description of the work taking place, that this day then is composed of two equal halves, a day half and a night half, separated by twilights, evening and morning. And I'm going to say that, and I'll explain it in a little bit here, that both twilights actually belong to the nighttime period of a day, because at the equinox of each year, at each equinox, basically we have half the day being daylight hours and half the day being nighttime. So we have equal 12 hours in both sides of that equation, but on that same day we only have about 9 hours of night and 3 hours of an hour and a half apiece of the two twilights. So it appears that the twilights probably belong to the nighttime reckoning. Okay, so that's what I've tried to illustrate first, and that is that here we have the fullness of a 24-hour day illustrated from here to here. When I get to this line, I have continued to illustrate, but only to show that, morning having come and completing itself, at the end of morning, we start all over again. The sun rises and we have a new day. This would be day 2, where this might have been day 1, this becomes day 2, or this might have been day 2, this now becomes day 3. That's the only reason I've illustrated this, and this is not germane to the conversation going forward, because really from here to here is the illustration of a day. Well, again, let's look at the construct that I've illustrated here. I have a first, second, and third, and fourth component of the day. These would be maybe considered periods. We have a first period, a second period, a third period, and a fourth period. And let me tell you why I've illustrated in such a manner. It's because when we open up, we are first told that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was formless and void, and there was darkness upon the deep, and the spirit of Elohim hovered over the waters, and then he moved upon them. I know that most of our translations will separate that, but that might have been part of that first day's work. I don't really know. What we are told once our translations are separating us for us is that on day 1, he also then created the light and said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And then he separated light from darkness, and he saw that it was good. And then there came to be evening, or then there was evening. But I'm going to stay with, and then there came to be evening, and then there came to be morning. So the very first day, he created this light and this dark period of time. And he doesn't say he created Ereb, but you could work it in there. You'll have to infer. I'm not claiming it to be explicit, but we all know there's an evening and a morning, not only because the scriptures are telling us here, but because that's what we see. If the creation account is to be true, we know that we have a daylight period of time where the sun is up and full of light, and we have a nighttime period where the sun is below the horizon or past the horizon on the other side of the world, and we have an evening and we have a morning. We know that experientially, but we also know that from Scripture. So how did it just describe day 1? He said he created the heavens, earth, and light, and separated light from dark, and there came to be evening and there came to be morning. Evening being the Hebrew word Ereb, transliterated, and morning being the Hebrew word Boker, translated. Now, in day 1, the separation of light and darkness, and then the mixing, because that's what we usually think of these two twilight periods, is light and dark mixed, because we have some sunlight left in the sky. Even though the sun's not there anymore, the sunlight remains there, and then when it comes back around, it re-enters the light, and we have a mixing of light and darkness. But whatever was creating the light and dark and the mixture on days 1, 2, and 3, and probably even the beginning of day 4, whatever it was not the sun, moon, and stars, because it didn't exist then. There's some other form of light, and we do have a reference in Revelation where we might get back to some of that when the New Jerusalem comes back down, that the type of light we're going to see, at least in the New Jerusalem, may be different than that created by the sunrise and the sunlight that we've been operating in for all our lives. Okay, so let's go to day 2. And in day 2, he created the firmament, and he separated the waters from above the firmament from the waters below it. And then there came to be evening, and then there came to be morning. Now, I meant to say and failed to do, there is no mention on day 1 of the night. But that seems to, again, we have to infer. I'm not claiming anything explicit here. What I will say must be, though, is that between this evening and this morning must be night. Otherwise, what he created would be different than what we see today. And that's possible. It's just not. It's highly unlikely. So we know that night must be there, even though there's no mention. And there's no activity. There's no work. It's just there. It's just there. He does mention evening and he does mention morning, and morning tends to be the end of that day, because after morning came and went, then the new day starts, and so does the new activity. And in day 2, as I said, he created the firmament. Then there came to be evening, no mention of night. Then there came to be morning, and upon completion of the morning, we have a new day, and we enter day 3, where he gathered the dry lands together, and he called that earth, and he gathered the waters together and called that seas, and he created the vegetations and the fruit. And then there came to be evening, and then there came to be morning. In between those two things would be that nighttime. And then we have the start of the new day after morning. And on day 4, he created the lights in the firmament for signs, appointed times, days, and years, the sun or greater light to rule the day, and the moon or lesser light to rule the night and stars. And then there was evening, and then there was morning, the 4th day. Well, having now created the sun, I've now introduced a sunrise, a sunset, which is what we're calling twilight, night with a moon here, and a morning, which is what we call twilight, because twilights, sunrise, twilight, night, and twilight are all affected and driven by sunlight now, starting during the course of day 4. So now we have a sunrise driving these days. So then starting in day 5, I would suggest, I'm having to infer it, but it's not explicitly taught here. But if we continue with this pattern, and our experience, what do we see in day 5? Starting in day 5, we're going to see light. We're going to see day. And what happens, what initiates the day? The sun entering the sky and providing the daylight. And we have 12 hours of the sun being in the sky, providing this daylight until it goes behind the horizon and continues to provide its light for a little bit, even though it's not direct light, it's indirect light of twilight. Then on day 5, while the sun is up, he begins to create the sea creatures and the birds. And then there is evening, which it's still Ereb and Boker, but now we know it's twilight or sunset. And then there's night, and then there's morning, which is just twilight. We now know it's twilight, and we're calling it morning, but it's still called Boker. And then at the end of day 5, we start a new day. We go into day 6, and the sun comes up and provides its daylight for the day for 12 hours during that equinox period of time. And during day 6, he creates the animals and he creates man. And then we have evening, and then we have Boker. We have Ereb, and then Boker. Between them, night again. So we have this twilight period once again, sunset and morning. Now on the 7th day, it's a little different, because during the daylight, when he's normally working, this day he ceased from his work, and he blesses it, and he sanctifies it, and he declares it to be not only his day of rest, but now going forward, the day of rest for everybody and everything associated with it. He keeps that day of rest. The angels keep that day of rest, the Malachim, and we are to keep that day of rest. When in the original days, we had the opportunity to do it right alongside of him. And when Israel was brought into the nation, they had that opportunity to do it right alongside of him, but they did not keep their place. And so we've all lost it. We've lost while we might be mimicking it, we might be memorializing it, we're probably almost certainly not keeping it at the same time that he is. But we are still trying to keep and learning how to keep those days that he thinks is important. And so I just want to make some comments on this that I've already addressed it a little bit, but I have a question here. Do the twilights belong to the day or the night? Well, the average hours of daylight. At the equinox, we see 12 hours. But if you take even the solstices and that would be the spring equinox and the fall equinox. But if you introduce the the solstices, the winter and the spring or summer solstices, which are the longest and shortest days, it still averages about 12 hours of daylight throughout the year. And we average about 3 hours of twilight throughout the year, and we average about 9 hours of night throughout the year. So it is suggestive that both of these evenings do not belong to day. Again, I'm inferring, I'm not claiming this to be explicit, but it seems probable that these twilight periods of time belong to the night. If we're going to divide, as he did in day one, where he's dividing light from dark, we have a 12-hour period of light and a 12-hour period of dark. Included in the dark would be the transition from light into darkness as the sun and its light first moves away and then comes back around for us. So I suggest that it's probable that the two twilights belong to the night, which affirms that morning that I know colloquially we all think is the beginning of a day because we refer to it that way. We all say we get up in the morning, and most of us do, and I'm going to show that to you in a moment. We literally are getting up in the morning, but the morning ends with the sunrise, with the sun coming up. And then we start the new day. And I'll try to illustrate that a little bit here. And just some additional notes here. In the Hebrew, the transliterated Hebrew, this day, not only this day, but this day, where he separates light from dark, this is Yom, Y-O-M. This is the transliterated Hebrew. He calls this daylight period Yom, but then he also says Yom Hichad, and then Yom, whatever the word is for second, he uses, and then Yom, the third day. So then he continues to use Yom to represent a 24-hour period of time, the wholeness, the completeness of the whole day. So we have some overlapping of this word Yom. Night is, I've seen it written a couple different ways, but in Bible Hub, the transliterated word they're giving us is this Layil, L-A-Y-I-L. That's how we refer to night. And then evening twilight is Areb, and the morning twilight is Boker. And that's what I've referenced in this picture. And now I ask you, is not what I just illustrated exactly the experience of man today? Isn't first daylight and work followed by evening and moving to night, then night and rest, followed by morning as the approaching of the new day? Is that not experientially what we all experience? So this creation account I've just given you is what you and I would intuitively say is the day. Let me illustrate that before I leave. So here is the same illustration, only with a little different information inside of it. First of all, here is the 12 hours of daylight, day, 12-hour average. And then here is the 12 hours of nighttime, actually including this, 12 hours. The actual night averages 9. The average evening or twilight averages 1.5 hours. And I say it belongs to the evening. So if you were to ask a man and say, okay, tell me how your day is. What do you do? Describe your day from beginning to end. What is the first thing he's going to tell you? I get up in the morning. And after getting up in the morning and getting prepared, I go off to work and I work throughout the day. At the end of my work day, I come home to wind down, and eventually I go to bed and sleep and rest and recoup from that day's work, only to, when morning comes back around, get up again and start the whole day over again. So here it is. You get up here and you go to work. That's the first thing you do. If you're going to break it into two pieces of a day, light and day, the separation of light and day, the first thing you do is go off to work. First thing you do is go off to work in the daylight hours. The second thing that you do is you sleep and rest during the night. So this is why in the creation account we have him working, and then he says, and there is evening and there is morning, no mention of night, because experientially that's when we're sleeping. For all of us, that night kind of disappears in dreams, and it's shortened because, if you have a good night's sleep, you're going to find that you went to sleep and you're waking up pretty quickly. You didn't just spend 9 hours in sleep, because that's not how you experience sleep, unless you're having a bad night, of course. So maybe that's why there's no mention of night in the creation account, but there is mention of this evening, the Areb and the Boker. And we know that the night comes between them. And I just threw in some various data that I went and gathered. I will tell you that the sunrise, here is March 17th. This is the spring equinox. During the spring equinox, and I used Indiana because that's where I live, during the spring equinox, the sun comes up, breaks the horizon. Sunrise is roughly 7:53 a.m. And it runs throughout the day till roughly, it sets at roughly 7:54 p.m. So it's roughly 12 hours of daylight on this spring equinox. Then we have a period of sunset that runs from just about 8 o'clock, just before 8 o'clock, that runs until night begins at 9:26, so just before 9:30. So that's where we get the hour and a half of twilight. From 7:54 to 9:26, we have this twilight. Night actually begins at 9:26 and runs until the sun comes back around and first begins to show some light in the sky. And that is called astronomical. I abbreviated it here, but it's astronomical twilight, followed by nautical twilight, followed by civil twilight. If you go into time and date, you can find these definitions. So the moment light begins to enter the sky, and we have the darkest period of twilight, but it's still twilight because sunlight has entered, that happens at 6:22. So night is running from 9:26 to 6:22 in the morning. That is roughly an hour and a half again. And so this means that this twilight then runs from 6:22 to roughly 7:53 a.m. when the new day starts. Maybe on 3/18 it'll be 7:54, because that's what happens. It starts to move. The day begins to elongate after the spring equinox. But you get roughly the same thing, an hour and a half of this twilight period in the morning. And then inside of this, let me come down here and just show you, and then I'll come back to what I've typed out in here. This is, again, the spring equinox, and everything I just told you is roughly here. So the daylight period runs from 7:53 a.m. to 7:54 p.m., which is roughly 12 hours of daylight, and the nighttime runs from 9:26 to 6:22, which is roughly 9 hours of night. If we come around to the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, and in 2026, that appears it's going to be on the 21st of June, that your day will run, your sun will come up at 6:14, and it will not set until 9:22, and that is 15 hours of daylight. Your shortest night then will be from 11:26 to 4:07 a.m., because that's when the astronomical twilight begins, and that's only 5.5 hours of night, literal dark night. And then in the fall equinox, we're back to something similar but different that we saw in the spring equinox, where the sun's coming up at 7:36, 15 minutes earlier than it did at the spring equinox, and it's setting roughly 15-20 minutes earlier than it did in the spring equinox, but it's still 12 hours of daylight. And then the nighttime ends up running from 9:08 p.m. to 6:04 a.m., which is 9 hours of night again. And when we get to the winter solstice, which is the shortest period, the shortest day of the year, which in 2026 should be December 21st, well, the sun comes up at 8:06 a.m., sets at 5:21 a.m., giving you 9.25 hours of daylight. And then nighttime actually begins with the end of the twilight starting at 7 p.m. We have darkness in the sky, and it runs till 6:27 a.m. before we see any more light appearing in the sky, and that's 11.5 hours of night. You average these, and it's not going to be exact, but it averages about this 9-hour average And the daylight averages about 12 hours, which is why it seems reasonable to include both the evening and the morning in the nighttime period of rest, the end of the day, morning belonging to night and representing the very end of a day experientially. But what do we see happening in America, who tends to have an 8-hour, I mean, many people work more, many people work less, and people don't necessarily work, are not 9 or 8 to 5ers. Many people have differing hours. But back in the days, and maybe if you were in Jerusalem back in those days, there are certain days where you had to work during the day because that's all you could work from. You needed the light, you needed the power, so people tended to work in the daytime, and it would be rare that you had somebody working overnight. It took electricity and other ways and things and types of work to get us to nighttime work and evening work. But still, so then roughly an average, just looking at the wake-up time in the United States, it starts at 6:46 a.m., at least on a work day. Well, 6:46 a.m. is earlier than the average 7:53. So this means we're getting up before the day begins. This means that we're getting up each day sometime and roughly shortly after, on average, the twilight period of time. So we're actually going to bed in this day, but we're also getting up in the same day so that we can get prepared to start the new day, it appears. By all appearances, I'm inferring. It's not explicit, but I'm inferring. But that seems to make sense because everybody's getting up in this morning period of time that belongs to the end of the day. So people go to sleep through the night, finish their sleep, and begin to get up so they can start their new day also in the night, also in the morning twilight. And I'm going to say here, in case I missed it earlier and I don't want to miss it, morning, this twilight period, this morning ends with twilight. It ends, morning ends with the new day. So even though in the Gregorian calendar we continue to call, morning right on up to noon, 12 p.m., that's not true of what we find in the creation account description. It's just not what we see. Then let's keep on going. The average astronomical twilight starts at 6:22 a.m. So basically we're getting up on average about 24 minutes after light begins to enter the sky. Obviously, some people get up early and some people get up later. But on average, once the sunlight starts filling the sky and the day is approaching again, people start getting up. And then the average sunrise here I've put is 7:45. And that's just, it's all rough. So the average workday is 8 hours, which means that the average start time is about 8 a.m. And if everybody takes an hour lunch, we're usually finishing up around 5 p.m. That's kind of the established 40-hour workday, the norm, the mean way of working. So that actually puts us, having gotten up in the nighttime, we're actually starting work once the day has begun on average. Now, different times a year, the sun will have been up for a while, and in the wintertime, it won't have gotten up yet. But on average, we're starting our work in the daylight hours of the day about 8 minutes after the sun comes up, and we have gotten up in preparation of that about an hour and a half to prepare for the start of our workday. And then if the average end time is 5 p.m. and where the average sunset is 7:54, then we're getting home a couple hours before we even hit. We know light is beginning to wane in the sky, but we haven't reached sunset yet. And experientially, that's true for most people. You get home during the daylight hours. You get home. As evening is approaching, you've prepared your evening dinner generally, and we're usually eating during these twilight evening hours, just like we experience in Passover. This is when we look at the day of Passover and how it's constructed. That's literally when you would start eating your Passovers, at this twilight evening hour, and this is the experience. And then having eaten and moved into nighttime, because all of the sunlight has now moved away, you enter. Well, people don't actually go to bed until around, on average, at least in the United States, till about 11:07. So they're staying up. On average, this is ending at 9:30. So they're staying up between 9:26 on average and 11 o'clock on average into the night. So people are staying up, probably watching TV, until sometime around 11 o'clock when they go to bed, get their 7 hours average of sleep between going to bed and waking up sometime here in the twilight hours of the morning. This is what we experience This is what we experience. This is the common experience of man. This is what is intuitive. I've spoken to people when asked, how are you observing Sabbath? Well, I'm observing when the sun comes up with sunrise. Well, why? Is it because you have studied and learned? And it's no, because that's just what makes sense. That is how my day works. And this is exactly what we see demonstrated for us in the creation account. So the pattern of our lives, the pattern of our typical lives, is the exact pattern established for us by Elohim at creation. Well, thank you, and may you be Baruch. If you find any value in this information, then I invite you to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.